Okay, so I'm sure you guys have heard about Charles Darwin, but there is a lesser known scientist named Lamarck, and we are going to learn about their two different ideas. So we're going to take our model, so those four main ideas that we talked about yesterday, and use it to compare how other models that have been proposed over time to explain trait changes. So we're going to take ours and compare it to others and see how they match up. But first, a brief history lesson. So over many years, scientists used to, let me start over. Over many years, scientists have used evidence available to them to explain how life on Earth has changed over time because they wanted to make sense of where things came from or how they were related. And around 400 BC, they thought that Earth was about 7,000 years old, and they imagined that species or living things were created separately and organized into an unchanging hierarchy. So wherever they laid in the hierarchy, kind of like a pyramid or like a general to a broad category, they were kind of stuck in that level, and humans were positioned just below the angels according to this timeline in 400 BC. But then around the 1700s, evidence emerged and proved that, in fact, Earth was older than 7,000 years old, that life had indeed changed over time, that many species had become extinct. They're finding things like fossils and bones and things like that that have showed that there were species that no longer existed on Earth, like at the time. And that there were organisms that, even though they were different, they shared a lot of similar characteristics and therefore seemed to have an ancestor that was in common. Then in the 1800s, they had a question. Why do traits change in populations over time? So just like the question that we had when we looked at the finches, we decided, how did the finches' beaks change over time? So they started looking at all these fossils and this data that they've collected, and they decided to ask, why do traits change in populations over time? And a few different models were proposed. So we're going to look at both of these models. One was given by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and the other by Charles Darwin. And they were both trying to answer the same question. So I do have two videos. So we're going to start with Lamarck's ideas, Darwin's ideas. They're both only like 2 minutes long. And then we're going to go to both. And that's when I can get my water since I'm quite parched. Sorry, everything's playing right now. Hold on. So I will go through it like as a summary, but just try and understand their main ideas. Like I said, you don't need to take notes or anything. As long as you're just paying attention closely, you'll be able to get their main ideas. And I'll summarize again. Like I said. So we're on Lamarck first, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Oh, I guess I should mute myself.
In this unit, we'll introduce you to a guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was an evolutionary theorist who believed that acquired characteristics were inherited and passed on from generation to generation. We'll also take a look at how there isn't really much evidence to show that his theory holds true today. Lamarck recognized that there were variations within populations. In this instance, we can see that butterflies have all sorts of different coloration. So the problem that he was trying to solve was, how do you get all these different variations within a population? Even in plants, he recognized that there were all sorts of different variations within a population. But even more perplexing was not the variation within a population, but all the variations that you see on the planet between species that gives us the massive biodiversity that we see on the planet today. So first, a little background about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was a French guy, and he lived between 1744 and 1829, which is nearly 200 years ago. So the theory of evolution has actually been around for quite a while now, but it's been changing as we gather more and more evidence. This French biologist recognized that there were all sorts of variations amongst animals on the planet. So he came up with a theory to explain all the diversity. He described evolution as organisms that acquire traits during their lifetime somehow pass these new traits on to their offspring. We know now that these traits are controlled by alleles. So Lamarck was basically stating that organisms gain new alleles during their lifetime, and they pass them on to their offspring. So at the end of the day, this idea of acquired traits really means that all the giraffes that used to have short necks developed longer necks so they could reach the branches of the trees. Unlike Darwin, Lamarck believed that living things evolved in a continuously upward direction from dead matter through simple to more complex forms toward human perfection. Therefore, species didn't die out in extinctions. Lamarck claimed that instead they changed into other species. Since both simple organisms and complex advanced animals exist today, Lamarck had to come up with an explanation for why we all don't have the perfected acquired traits that developed over time. So he thought that at any given time, new life was constantly being created from dead matter by spontaneous generation. According to Lamarck, organisms altered their behavior in response to the environmental changes. Their changed behavior, in turn, modified their organs, and their offspring also inherited these improved structures. Part of Lamarck's theory stated that traits that we use end up developing, while traits that we don't use end up disappearing. So if we were to remove the tail of a mouse, because it's not using it, we would expect the offspring to be born without tails. But that's not actually what happens, does it? In fact, if we were to allow the next generation to populate, they would be born with tails too. So the idea of acquired traits from generation to another really doesn't hold up. But it's also very important to note that while Lamarck's theory is not accepted in the scientific world today, it was still very important in helping put evolution on the map.
The Galapagos Islands. Young English naturalist Charles Darwin collects animal and plant specimens for study. His observations on these islands will be fundamental to formulating his theories, which many years later will be published in his great work on the origin of species. A revolutionary book that changed the way biology was understood, giving rise to new scientific theories. In this book, Darwin laid down the scientific principle that each species had not always been the way we know it today. Rather, each one had changed and altered over time. Three concepts are important for understanding Charles Darwin's theories: natural selection, evolution, and the origin of species. In animals and plants, random trait mutations and modifications can appear. For example, a moth that is born a different color than its parents. Imagine that this mutation or new trait improves an animal's ability to survive in its environment. Animals with this favorable trait would be better adapted to where they live and have a better chance to feed themselves and to reproduce than other animals of the same species without that trait. The offspring of parents with favorable characteristics will normally inherit those same characteristics. So, generation after generation, a trait that was rare occurs more frequently, becoming the norm within the species. This process is called natural selection. With the passing of time, these favorable mutations accumulate and species change, constantly adapting to an environment that never stops changing. Here's how the evolution of species takes place. Two groups of animals of the same species that adapt to two different environments over time can come to constitute different species. This way, a process as simple as natural selection helps us to understand the origin of species. Charles Darwin was one of the most important men of his era, and many consider him among the most influential scientists in history. His theories on the origin and evolution of species were very new for his time and are still studied and discussed to this day. Darwin died in 1882. His legacy changed the thinking of an era and opened the door to a new way of understanding science, the world, and the role humans play on this planet.
Premium membership will help your child master more math skills. Earn more.
Today, many of you will have heard of evolution and natural selection, but it hasn't always been this way. In the early 19th century, scientists were still very much in the dark as to how living things evolved. While the idea of evolution had been around for a while, the phenomenon went unnamed and was without a proposed mechanism until Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had an idea. Lamarck, a zoologist, noted that animals seemed very well suited to their environments and suspected that throughout their lifetimes, animals improved themselves. For example, a giraffe's long neck was thought to be the result of the animal's continual stretching in order to reach food that was higher and higher from the ground. Lamarck also thought that these changes caused by the animal's struggle to survive were passed on to the next generation, which then continued the evolutionary process. In other words, a new baby giraffe would have a longer neck as a result of its parents stretching for their food. Before looking into another theory of evolution, a little test for you. According to Lamarck's idea, what would happen if two animals that had spent their lives using their right limbs far more than their left limbs had offspring? If you said something similar to their offspring would have had overdeveloped set of right limbs, you're right. Around 2 years after Lamarck's death, a young Charles Darwin set off on a voyage that would change his life and science forever. Prior to setting sail on the HMS Beagle, Darwin had spent some time studying under some of Lamarck's contemporaries, and thus had an understanding of Lamarck's theories on inheritance. What he found on his voyage, however, did not seem to fit with Lamarck's ideas. Instead, Darwin developed his own idea of descent with modification. The key difference here is that in Darwin's idea, the traits of the parents were passed on without being modified by the life of the parent. What Darwin realized was the importance of the fact in any population of living organisms there already exists variation in any given characteristic. As a result, he argued nature would favor, or select, the fittest variants. This is natural selection. By fitness, Darwin meant the ability of an individual to survive and to pass on its characteristics to the next generation. Over time, changes in the characteristics of a species could occur. He also proposed that the changes within a species occurred very slowly through a gradual process. In the case of the giraffe neck, natural selection would continually favour giraffes with longer necks, so that over time the average neck length in the population would gradually increase. Following over 20 years of work, Darwin eventually published his idea of evolution by natural selection, after another man named Alfred Russel Wallace wrote him a letter saying that he had thought of the exact same thing. But that's a story for another video.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget.
Oh, no, you're done making funny faces in the chat. I'm half kidding. Okay, so like I said, I would review, because I know there's kind of just like a lot of listening. I know you're going to listen to me, but maybe I'm a little more entertaining. I don't know. So overall, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's model, like how he made our class model, he made a model, and his went like this. That number one, more individuals are born than the environment can support, so there's a struggle to survive. Second step is that all individuals in a species are alike at the beginning, like when they're born or at the beginning of time or whatever. But some respond to the pressure of the environment by developing a new trait that gives them a better chance to survive. Then step 3, when those parents reproduce or they give their offspring then, the babies, would inherit the new trait as they developed or as they grew during their lifetime. And then step 4, eventually all the members of the species would have this favorable or better trait. And this came up nearly 2,400 years after the Greeks first proposed a hierarchy of life. So that kind of that thing I talked about in the beginning with the steps. And Lamarck then proposed this model that explained trait change over time. So based on his model, we're going to use a specific phenomenon, so giraffe necks, and see how it would be explained. So if we think about giraffes, how did giraffes with long necks evolve from ancestors with shorter necks? If we were Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, this is what we would say. That all early giraffes had the same shorter necks. So when giraffes were put on this earth, they all had short necks. And then as the giraffe population would increase, there wasn't enough food within reach. So if the trees are all around the same height at the bottom, then where all the short-necked giraffes can eat, there would be no more leaves. So some of the giraffes started stretching their necks to reach food higher up in the trees, like the video. Then step 3 would be the more that these giraffe necks stretched, the longer their necks grew. And then when these longer stretched neck giraffes reproduce, they pass on their longer stretched necks to their offspring, who then stretch their necks even more. So eventually all giraffes would have long necks, according to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And here's a little picture about giraffes. We're just going to go into Darwin because we kind of already made our model. So then the next model we're going to compare Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's to is Darwin. So someone you probably heard about. And he proposed this model to explain trait change over time. So he has a little bit more steps, but he starts with that more individuals are born in a species than the environment can support. So if we're talking about carrying capacity and our logistic growth, it's above the carrying capacity. So there is a struggle for everyone to survive. Then within the species, there's a naturally existing variation. So kind of like what we said, where the finches might have medium, small, or large beaks. Then number 3 was that the variations give some of the animals or species an advantage over others in the struggle. And then more of the individuals will survive and reproduce than will those with the less favorable traits. So like we said, the advantageous trait would be able to survive and reproduce. And many of these traits then are passed from the parents to offspring, more of the better or advantageous traits. And then number 6, more individuals with favorable traits will reproduce. So the number of individuals with the favorable traits increases every generation, and the number with less favorable traits decreases. So kind of like what we said, when you start surviving, you are able to find a mate with the same traits and reproduce and give your traits to your offspring. And then he concluded with, eventually the less favorable trait becomes the most common form, but variation still exists. So like we said, they might not go extinct, then there's still a variety. All right, so we are, I think now, yes. All right, so we are gonna go into a card sort activity. So if you guys said that you like to work in groups, well, don't go assuming around here. It's very hurtful and disrespectful. Sorry, I'll try not to assume anymore. Sorry, Miss Turner was asking me a question. I'm very distracted. Anyway, if you said you like to work in groups, I just made kind of one big group. You guys can work together, or you can split off into littler groups if you want to. If you want to do this by yourself, that's fine too. I will send you a meet in Google Hangouts. But basically, here's what we're gonna do. So in your classroom, I have this Jamboard, and we need to sort the ideas into, it's kind of like a Venn diagram, but with stickies. And you can zoom in right here. There's a plus button, or you can zoom out, and you just move the stickies to who you think it is. So I can read this one. When the drought eliminated the small seeds, the birds got bigger beaks so they could eat bigger seeds. So we have to figure out who that would be. Would it be something that Darwin would say? Would it be something that both of them would say? Or would it be something that Lamarck would say? If you want, you can even change the color of the stickies and make them like color coordinated. It's whatever you want. I'll start doing it alone. That is fine. Like I said, if you want to work with people, you can. If you, sorry, I'm trying to send the Google Hangout Meet to the group. So I sent that out. Like I said, if you want to work alone, you can. This isn't graded yet. We're going to do another activity with it tomorrow. So I'm not going to give you the right answers, or not tomorrow, but Monday. So I'm not going to give you the right answers until next week. But try your best.